What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I just finished the first two episodes of Daredevil Born Again, Season 1. And we need to talk about this because I know there's different reactions to the show online, right? Social media and review sites and so on and so forth. By the way, this video is going to have spoilers. Full transparency here. And I feel like a lot of you guys did this exact same thing. I went into the show basically expecting this almost seamless transition from the Netflix era to Daredevil Born Again. And so when I say that, I mean that I expected the Netflix show in both tone and feel when it came to Born Again. Of course, we don't get that here. And I was a little bit disappointed initially. And I'll talk about, what I mean by that here in a second. But the original Netflix series, of course, there's a nostalgia, right? The first real show that Marvel had for the Marvel Cinematic Universe beyond the films. And we all loved it, right? But in the original Netflix show, there was this kind of darkness that permeated the entire show. And that darkness highlighted the fact that Daredevil was not Matt Murdock's alter ego, that Matt Murdock was Daredevil's alter ego, right? In the sense that at his core, Matt Murdock was the devil of Hell's Kitchen. And so, again, all the little themes that sort of fed into the original Netflix show, I expected all of that here. But it doesn't have that. And again, I was initially disappointed here. But after a while, I was kind of like, okay, let's acknowledge the fact that the Daredevil era happened on Netflix. And let's just kind of take the show on its own merits. And once I did that, I really actually started to enjoy it. Now, don't get me wrong. I do think there's a few issues. Case in point, it doesn't feel like the Netflix series, but it also doesn't feel like a Marvel Cinematic Universe product, if that makes any sense. It doesn't feel like Iron Man. It doesn't feel like Winter Soldier. It doesn't feel like Infinity War. It doesn't feel like Spider-Man. It almost kind of feels like it doesn't quite know what it is, right? What's the tone and the mood of the show supposed to be? And there are moments where we're given the tone and the mood of the show, but we're given that tone and mood more through the context of the scene, right? The city's reaction to Wilson Fisk becoming mayor of New York, the response of Matt Murdock to Wilson Fisk becoming mayor of New York, that is contextual from one scene to the next. But there doesn't really seem to be an overarching theme or mood for the show. It's just a series of sequences that feature Matt and a series of sequences that feature Wilson Fisk and all the other members of the supporting cast. That being said, we're only 2 episodes in, so I think it's really too early to say whether or not the show is a hit or a failure. And I know a lot of people who are kind of part of the naysaying crowd of Marvel Studios are looking for the first opportunity to say the show sucks, right? And they're already jumping on that. Whereas I think there are other people who are hyper supporters of the MCU, won't hear a word against it, and are looking for every opportunity to say the show is one of the greatest shows ever made by Marvel Studios. Honestly, I'm kind of in the middle ground here. Now, here's the other thing that I also want to draw attention to is that I'm also approaching this show as a comic book fan, which is to say, I am used to different interpretations of characters and teams by different writers. So Brian Michael Bendis' Daredevil run feels completely different from Chip Zdarsky's run, and both of those are starkly different from the Marvel Knights Daredevil run in the late 1990s. So I'm used to a scenario where a writer comes along and they just totally change the tone and mood of a character within reason, right? I mean, you can't really have a writer who comes along and turns the Daredevil comic into a comedy. That just wouldn't really make any sense. But for him to not be as dark and brutal as we're used to, or for him to be more extreme than we're traditionally used to. So again, I think that might be one of the things that's also influencing my perception of the show in relation to the original Daredevil series on Netflix. Having said that, let's talk about the things that I love about this. Number one, I love the whole element of Devil's Reign. It's one of the coolest things. And I will say this, Devil's Reign was one of the coolest stories that Marvel had done in years up to that point. Because ever since the events of Infinity War and Avengers Endgame, Marvel was focusing on a lot of high-level top-down events. But Marvel wasn't really focusing on a lot of smaller, localized crossover events, which is to say, here's an event that takes place in the city of New York. Now, more recently, we got stories like Gang War, which was not very good. But Devil's Reign was the story where Wilson Fisk became mayor of New York. And it was so cool because the way the story transpired, and we mentioned this before, right? In the comics, the way the story transpired was during Secret Empire when Captain America was revealed to be a Hydra agent, when his history was changed using a cosmic cube, that New York City was locked in the dark dimension, right? And that while the superheroes spent all their time trying to figure out how to get the city out of the dark dimension, no one was looking out for the people on the ground level except for Wilson Fisk. And so when everything returned to normal and the day was saved, the citizens of New York recognized the fact that he was there for them when no one else was, and they voted him for mayor. And so he immediately outlaws superheroes, right? Vigilantes. And so I love that all those elements are being carried over here. One of the other things that I love about Wilson Fisk is that he's still the kingpin in the most important way, which is to say, he's willing to do whatever it takes in order to win. And that really is notable when he has the whole conversation in the meeting with the commissioner, where he like shows them a picture of the kid. Now, seemingly, the child is a product of an affair. At least that seems to be the case. I have a hard time believing that the commissioner of New York would hide his child away in the outskirts of Philadelphia. I guess maybe New York's a pretty crazy place, but it seemed to be more of a product of like an affair, an extramarital affair or something like that. And so Wilson Fisk basically blackmailing the commissioner of the police in New York City into staying on board and then rejecting everything the commissioner needs in order for the police to have a greater foothold in the city is classic Wilson Fisk. It's classic Kingpin. I do like the references of like Spider-Man, right? The idea that he says, we don't really need, somebody in a spider suit to protect us. I do wish there were a few more references to everything that had gone on in the city of New York in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, even if they're not referencing like the original Avengers film or anything like that. If there was some reference to like Stephen Strange or some reference to, I don't know, the passing of Tony Stark or to Sam Wilson as Captain America, especially, because I think if they don't do any of that, one of the biggest issues this show could potentially run into is the same issue that it had in the Netflix series, where consciously we know that it's part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a greater narrative, but we don't feel like it is. It just kind of feels like it's out there doing its own thing, separated from everything else that's happening, almost as if it's in a wholly different reality, right? And so I think having a little more connection to the MCU would definitely strengthen the show. But again, we're only 2 episodes in. I don't know what they're going to do for the remaining, 7 episodes? I think it's 9 for season 1. So there's a lot more Easter eggs and little things that can be thrown in here. Another thing that I found really cool is White Tiger. And I like how they're just sort of teasing the character of White Tiger in Marvel. That all we really have so far is video footage, right? During the robbery in the bodega that he ultimately thwarted. For those of you guys who are familiar with White Tiger, right? One of the cool things about White Tiger is the White Tiger amulet and the Sons of the Tiger more or less originate from Kunlun. In Power Man and Iron Fist number 74, that all was kind of introduced. And then actually Ava Ayala, I think is how you pronounce her name, she was introduced in Avengers Academy. But the original White Tiger was Hector, right? Now, of course, Hector ended up being killed, I think, in 2003 by Gideon Mace and a few other people. And that's where Ava basically became the new White Tiger in his stead. So I do like that they're drawing on like the original source material in order to introduce the character of White Tiger in Marvel. For the White Tiger abilities, think of like a less capable version of Black Panther, if we're being honest, right? Enhanced strength, speed, durability, things like that. There's a few other abilities, in fact, that White Tiger has that someone like Black Panther doesn't have, right? The ability to like blend in with their environment if they're standing perfectly still, different things like that. It also kind of goes hand in hand with like 2 other amulets. Again, they kind of originate in Kunlun, and it all draws its powers from the Tiger God, essentially. And if you guys are interested, we can make a more comprehensive video on the nature of White Tiger in Marvel Comics. But I love what they're kind of building up here too, right? The idea that they're kind of taking their time by bringing Hector on board, and then eventually he will become an ally to Daredevil, hopefully, and they'll become a kind of like team-like duo. I don't know how far that's going to go, but I do like that idea, that it's kind of playing out that way. But one of the things that I like about this show that I feel like the original Netflix series kind of lacked is that there's more emphasis on the legal aspect of Matt Murdock. And that's one of the things that you kind of see in Marvel Comics. Depending on who's writing the story at the time, there are stories out there where the entire run focuses more on Matt Murdock as a lawyer than it does on Daredevil. There are stories where it's the inverse, like the Chip Zdarsky run, where he focuses more on Matt Murdock being Daredevil than being a lawyer. And in fact, that's 90% of the runs that exist out there. And then there's runs that try to strike a balance, right? Where they show Matt Murdock as a lawyer and then they show him as Daredevil. And, the story arcs kind of blend together in order to give him a reason to, become Daredevil or operate as Daredevil in relation to whatever case is going on. But I do like that we're getting a little more of the legal work and the kind of stuff he does, that he takes up cases that are pro bono, especially in the case of Hector, just by overhearing the conversation, learning about the case, learning he's being, basically accosted by cops, and then taking the case on despite how difficult it may be. But I like that there's a balance that's struck here. Now, again, it's not to say the Netflix series didn't cover any of that. I mean, there were some great elements of that in the Netflix show, and it looks like they're carrying that over here. I just like that it feels like it plays more of a significant role. That being said, I think this is where sometimes it feels like it falls short. I don't mean for this to be like an insult, and I know some people are just going to be like, boo hiss, boo hiss. But in some ways, I kind of feel like I guess, I don't know if I'd call it camaraderie or the relationship, non-romantic, between Matt Murdock and, I can't remember her name, the woman that he works with, the one that plays McDuffie, right, that works at the new, I guess, legal counsel business, whatever it is that Matt Murdock works at. It almost kind of gives off like CW Flash vibes, right? In the sense that it's just sort of like, I kind of feel some hints of the Flash. Just in terms of writing and kind of how the scene is set and how they relate to each other, it gives me throwbacks to like Candace Patton and Grant Gustin in like the coffee shop, or when he comes to visit her at her job or something along those lines. Now, again, I don't mean for that to be an insult. It's simply just, that's an example of the mood feeling so starkly different from something that we saw from the Netflix era. And that brings me into, I think, probably the biggest talking point of the show, which is seemingly Marvel writing out the entire supporting cast. Number one, they killed off Foggy Nelson in the first episode, right? Like he's done and gone. And they killed him off with a quickness too, right? He dies within the first, maybe 20 minutes of the show. And I think a lot of people saw that coming, right? There were these different reveals and different leaks that, leakers and scoopers, they get stuff right like 10% of the time. But this is one of those instances where they happen to be right. And it was just sort of like somebody's going to die in the first episode. And I think most everybody guessed that it was going to be Foggy Nelson, which kind of sucks, right? Shortly after that, when you get to the trial, Karen Page seemingly says her piece to Matt Murdock, and she's out of the show. And so for me, that's incredibly disappointing because the relationship between Foggy Nelson and Karen Page and Matt Murdock is one of the things that made the Netflix series so great. Because what it did is it allowed the writers of the show to just send Matt Murdock off as Daredevil. And instead of Matt Murdock having to ground himself, that it was actually Foggy and Karen that kind of brought him back to reality, right? They were his anchors to the real world. And so oftentimes over the course of the original Netflix show, we would kind of found ourselves wondering what would happen if they weren't there? How far off the rails would Matt end up going? And in fact, we saw that to a degree in season 2 and then eventually in season 3. And so it's just kind of like to see them sort of just written out of the show almost as a kind of like farewell, right? This is we threw this in here for fan service. For those of you guys who love the original Netflix show, now we're telling our story. It's kind of disappointing. That I'm not the biggest fan of. I loved Deborah Ann Wall as Karen Page. I thought she was phenomenal. But again, Foggy Nelson and all those guys, it's kind of disappointing to see them essentially moved out of the show. Now, again, it's not to say they won't return, because again, we're 2 episodes in. That being said, seeing Matt Murdock finally snap back into kind of becoming Daredevil, even if it was only momentarily, was really cool, because now we're kind of left wondering, what's he going to do with the bodies, right? Because you can't have Matt Murdock as the lawyer for Hector, the star witness, having basically bailed out of the apartment. And in the star witness's apartment are the bodies of 2 cops, one of which is the one who was the partner of the cop that was killed by Hector, or supposedly killed by Hector, right? The entire circumstance would actually be worse for Matt than anything else, right? It would just basically condemn Hector to multiple life sentences, capital murder, and definitely execution. And so, because of that, it does kind of complicate things a bit. And I am excited to see, where that complicated trajectory goes. But I'm also excited to see the psychological effect that it's going to have on Matt Murdock, right? The idea of him momentarily snapping back and whether or not he just sort of goes back to like the exceedingly dark Daredevil that we know from the Netflix series, or if he's going to be a more toned down version. And this is the final point that I want to bring up here, right? This is the final thing that I really want to bring up here. The fight between Matt and Bullseye. You cannot tell me with a straight face that was not a great fight. That was a phenomenal fight. That was an incredible fight. I loved that sequence between the two of them. It was amazing. And I love that they just kind of did Bullseye. It's just like a dude with like a mask over his head. Maybe they'll get around to the point where he gets like the whole Bullseye suit, right, with like the target on his chest and that kind of thing. But I will say, man, Bullseye in the comics, right, he is this incredibly slept on villain in Marvel Comics. A lot of people don't realize how capable Bullseye is. That he's more than just like a guy who's super accurate. He's like a master martial artist. There was a point that I think it took place in Shadowland. I can't remember off the top of my head, which, by the way, let me know if you guys are interested in that. Shadowland is a story where Daredevil becomes a villain. But there's a point in that story where Bullseye fights like 100 members of the Hand. And the Hand are like the super secretive, mystical ninja organization, right? These are some of the best fighters in the world, right? Even Wolverine trained with the Hand for like a period of time. In that story, Bullseye fights off 100 of them, or something along those lines. The guy is incredibly capable. So I loved seeing him get the upper hand of Matt Murdock a couple times. Plus, it was kind of dope to see Matt Murdock staggering through a hallway with daggers in his chest. It was pretty wild, right? It was really, really amazing. But all in all, right? I mean, as far as the overall show goes, right? I mean, what kind of rating would I give it here? I mean, I certainly wouldn't put it as high as Daredevil season 1. I mean, I'd probably rank, Daredevil season 1, season 3, and then Born Again, and then Daredevil season 2 from Netflix. That's probably how I would rank it, right? I mean, it's not a terrible show, right? It's got its faults. It's got, some things that I'm not the biggest fan of. But again, we're only 2 episodes into it. So this opinion could totally change by the time we get to the end of the series. But I want to hear from you guys. What do you guys think about Daredevil Born Again? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Were you just kind of like, it's a thing that exists, right? Let me know down in the comment section. Thank you all for watching. Oh, also, people are going to say, Rob, you forgot about Muse? No, I didn't forget about Muse. Like, there's nothing to talk about. He was a dude who showed up to the book signing of a therapist and asked her for a session. There's literally nothing to talk about there. So, yeah, I mean, I guess acknowledging that. Anyway, peace.